As we continue our study now of the culture in which we seek to live out our Christian lives, I want to turn our attention in this session to another strand of philosophy that heavily influences our culture and is, if you recall, is one of those subdivisions of the broad, generic perspective that we call secularism. And that philosophy that I'm going to be concerned about today is called pragmatism. How many of you have never heard of the word pragmatism before? Well, that's good. You know, people are somewhat frightened by words like existentialism and logical positivism, but everybody's heard the term pragmatism. I suspect that there's a reason for that, because pragmatism as a formal philosophy was developed and expanded in the United States. Most of the philosophical movements that affect our culture are transported from Europe, come across the sea, and then they make their impact felt here in this nation. But pragmatism was born and raised in the United States and reflects something of the genius of the American culture itself. Now, I have made references in the past to a little book that was published in the 60s that was very, very surprising in the impact that it had within the church and in the intellectual world, because it was more or less a semi-popular work of philosophy and religion, and it was written by Harvey Cox. How many of you have heard of Harvey Cox, the Harvard professor? Okay. Cox's book that made him famous was entitled The Secular City. And what Dr. Cox was trying to do in that little book was to write a contemporary book that would be somewhat similar to St. Augustine's classic work, The City of God. And the very title calls attention to the change in Western civilization from a society and a culture that looked to God for its values, that looked heavenward for its goal and its destination, to modern culture, which, as we've seen with secularism and existentialism and humanism, has more or less abandoned the eternal as the reference point for its own definition and its own formation and shaping. We now live not in the city of God, but in the secular city. And what Cox was trying to do was to apply to the American culture a yardstick of evaluation that used both theological categories of evaluation and sociological and anthropological categories. And I would have to say I think Cox was a better sociologist than he was a theologian. But he makes some interesting observations about our society. He talks about the shape of America, and he talks about the style of America. And when he comes to an evaluation of the style of America, he points immediately to pragmatism as being the dominant influence in producing the style of American life. And he uses as the symbol that embodied pragmatism. Remember, this book was written in the 60s. He used John Fitzgerald Kennedy as the supreme example of American pragmatists. He says, and I won't read a lengthy passage here, but just in passing, he says, "Urban secular man is pragmatic. He devotes himself to tackling specific problems and is interested in what will work to get something done. He has little interest in what has been termed borderline questions of metaphysical considerations. He wastes little time thinking about ultimate or religious questions." And as he goes on to explain here, the spirit of pragmatism is the spirit of problem solving. The pragmatist is basically either skeptical or agnostic about man's ability to discover ultimate truth. And so what the pragmatist says, I don't have time in my life to figure out all the mysteries that are clouded in the universe about ultimate reality and ultimate purpose and all of that sort of thing that religion and philosophy has been traditionally concerned about. I have to be busy with living. And my life involves encountering a myriad of problems. And so I've got to find the solutions to those problems. And so that hardcore realist is a man who's asking this basic question: what works? Not what is fancy and pleasing to the intellect in terms of theory, but what is it that brings results? That's what the pragmatist is interested in. But again, as a formal philosophy, it proceeds from a prior skepticism of metaphysics or of theology. Now, what do we mean by metaphysics? There's a word that is, you know, everyday word for the philosopher, but is not a word that we find on the soap operas every day in America. Metaphysics, what does that mean? Does anybody know?
Meta means alongside.
Meta means alongside or with. That's exactly right. Okay? And you know what physics is? We have the science of physics that studies the order and the behavioral forces and all of that of nature. It's a natural science. Metaphysics, we could say, is not the study of physics or the study of nature, but is the study of that which is alongside or above and beyond that which is supra or supernatural. Metaphysics looks beyond what can be seen and observed in the sphere of natural science to ask those ultimate questions. What is ultimate reality? Is there a God? Is there not a God? That's a metaphysical question. And so men for centuries have sought to unravel the mysteries of metaphysics. But a period of skepticism came in after the Enlightenment, particularly in the 19th century. And at the same time, enormous advances were being made in man's ability to cope with his world. With the Industrial Revolution, the breakthrough in science and medicine and so on. And that there was a sense in which the hostile forces of nature were being tamed. The light bulb, you know, modern medicine, and so on. And so modern man is saying, hey, I don't have time. I'm so involved in working out my life, and we're getting the answers to our problems. We look to the scientific community to solve the problem of cancer and so on. Who has time to be fooling around with metaphysical considerations? And so a whole philosophy emerged that looked at life from this side, from a perspective of naturalism, of natural science, and tried to frame a whole philosophy of living on the basis of that. And we call that pragmatism. Now, there is an easy point of confusion here between Christianity and pragmatism. Because in our vocabulary, in the common language of our day, we often use the term pragmatic as a synonym for what other word? Practical. You see? We want to be practical. And I get that all the time when I'm teaching theology and everything. People say, oh, we don't have time to study theology, R.C. You know, we want to be practical. Because doesn't God, in the final analysis, really care more about our practice than anything else? He does. The Bible is always talking. By their fruits you shall know them. You know, by their practice, by what you do, really reveals what you think and what you believe. And God, from the beginning on, has been very, very much concerned about how we live out our faith in practice. Okay? So the pragmatist is very much worried about being practical. But so is the Christian. The Christian's also concerned about practice and about being practical. But being practical does not mean that you must embrace pragmatism as a philosophy of life. In fact, where the tension comes, where the collision occurs between Christianity and pragmatism, which I'll try to explain more in just a minute, where that point of conflict is that Christianity says that ultimately pragmatism as a philosophy is the most impractical thing that a person could ever embrace. So I hope that this group of people will be careful about distinguishing between being practical and being pragmatic. Now, what's the point of distinction? Let me back up just a second. Just yesterday I was lecturing on Romans 1 and the conclusion of Romans 1, where Paul is explaining that God's judgment is being manifested to the world, and that God's judgment is poured out. Why? Because God reveals himself to man. And the bottom line is that man does not see fit to take seriously the knowledge of God. In other words, he does not approve the idea of spending much time thinking about or learning about the character of God. Therefore, God gives man over to a reprobate mind to do those things which are not proper. And then that catalog of vices that he concludes with in Romans 1. Murder, strife, covetousness, gossip, okay? Haters of God, disobedient to parents, malicious, malignant, and so on. He gives this dreadful list of human vices. But the point that the apostle is making is that there is a causal relationship, a natural consequence. When man will not have God in his thoughts, that immediately is reflected in what man does. And if you think that God is not worthy of your mental consideration, that will have a massive impact on your life and on the style of your life. How could it not? I mean, there's a sense in which not everybody is theoretically oriented, but everybody is involved in practice. Philosophers have to live, and non-philosophers have to live. We're all involved in the practice of living. But whether it's a sophisticated, formally developed concept or not, what we live, how we behave, is the clearest expression of what our theories really are. Nobody operates without a theory. You may not be able to articulate it. You may not be able to write an essay about it. And you just say, and it may be filled with contradictions. But you have a value system. You have a theory. You have an understanding of the meaning of life and what is good and what isn't good, what is valuable and what isn't valuable. And you act accordingly. And so do I. Now, the conflict between pragmatism and being practical, and the conflict between pragmatism and Christianity is at this level. That pragmatism is a theory of truth. Practicality is a test for truth. You look at that and you say, what is that, a distinction without a difference? Grab a hold of this distinction. Pragmatism as an ism is a theory of truth. Practicality is a test for truth. We have our theories, and then we must test our theories to see whether or not they are validated or falsified. Now, what the pragmatist says is, the pragmatist theory of truth is that which works. The good is that which works. But built into that is the skepticism with respect to ever really coming to an understanding of transcendent norms. Remember I said metaphysical agnosticism. One of the great ironies of American history is that at Harvard University in the 19th century, the philosophy students at Harvard started a club. And that club was named the Metaphysical Club. Okay? That is to say that they defined their purpose and their goal of the club as to be students of philosophy who specialized in concerns of a metaphysical nature. And at the same time, there were three men who were members of that club who were classmates. William James, Charles Peirce, and Oliver Wendell Holmes, who along with John Dewey became the leading spokesman for the philosophy of pragmatism in the American culture. In other words, pragmatism grew out historically of a group of fellows in a little fraternity in Harvard who were committed to the precepts of metaphysics. But out of that growing spirit of skepticism with respect to understanding transcendent norms, these fellows began to look for an alternative approach to things. They said, okay, we can't know ultimate truth. We can't know ultimate values. We can't go to the other side. We're stuck by living here. So how do we know what's right? Well, by experimentation. And William James, how did he approach religion? He's written a classic called The Varieties of Religious Experience, where he analyzes your experience. You say you're a Christian. You would go into Dr. James's study and he would say, okay, tell me about your Christian experience. And you would begin to explain to him that you grew up in such and such a home and then you had a crisis experience when you were 21 and you were converted to Christianity. And he would begin to probe and see how your attitudes changed, how your behavioral patterns changed, how your inner feelings changed. And he would say, okay, has this been a positive experience for you or a negative experience for you? And you say, well, it's been a positive experience for me. So for you, religion works. Religion works. It helps you cope. It helps you make it in this world. And so for you, religion is good and religion is true. What does that say about whether or not there's a God? At that point, to this point, nothing. Now, the earlier pragmatists, incidentally, believed that there was a God, but you couldn't know very much about him. But they thought that the corporate experience of mankind tended to validate the idea that there was a God. Later, pragmatists moved away from that into a more atheistic bent. But the bottom line concern, again, was not whether there is such a thing as ultimate truth, because you can't know it, but what works. And I've had people come to me. I mean, it embraces a kind of relativism with respect to truth and relativism with respect to goodness. And we'll consider relativism in our next session as a separate dimension. But I've talked before about the person that came to me and said, R.C., do you believe in God? I said, yes. Are you glad that you believe in God? Yes. Does it make a difference in your life? Yes, it makes a difference in my life. It helps me through all kinds of things. And I said, well, I don't feel the need for God. So, but for you, God is true. For me, there is no God. I don't need God. Now, what's going on here? We've redefined truth. Truth, classically, is defined by truth corresponds to what is objectively, what is real. Now, truth is determined by what works for me, or for you, or even for the group. The problem comes in when it works for you, but it doesn't work for you. Which is true? Well, they're both true. One of the things that bothered Dewey had disdain for the science of epistemology, which is the science of knowledge, and said that, and his critics constantly accused him of subjectivism, and he didn't like that, but he never really escaped it. Because if I finally determine what is true by what works for me, then the test for truth ultimately is my opinion, my subjective reaction. I'm saying that's working. But the question is, how long does it work? And to what degree does it work? See, when I say that it's one thing to have practicality as a test for truth, yes, practicality is, I mean, what good is faith if it doesn't work? Huh? But then you have to ask the obvious question, work to what end? Work for what? If the truth is that which works, I have to add the question, truth is that which works what? What good is it producing? You have to have some standard, some norm to determine whether the results are good results or not good results, other than pure preference and arbitrary things. Somebody, a college student, is having trouble in college. He set out to get an education because he had a long-range goal. He wanted to become a doctor. But he's having struggle, and he's disappointed now in college, and so he decides to go out and get stoned on drugs. Now, as soon as he uses the drugs, he's gotten rid of the pain of his depression. And he's no longer upset about his future. And he's sort of floating around in space, and you say to him, well, do you think this is good? He says, yes, it solved my problem. And that's been the other chief criticism of pragmatism, that pragmatism tends to focus, and we've mentioned this throughout this course, short-term consequences. Now, go back to Harvey Cox and his appeal to John Kennedy as an image of American pragmatism, as a symbol. And he even goes earlier than that. He goes to FDR as an example in his analysis of American culture. And we say, okay, what happens is the nation is paralyzed, caught in the grip of a depression. The economy has collapsed. The forward growth and progress of America has come to a screeching halt. You know, people were selling apples on the street to survive. Industry shut down. High rate of unemployment. And, you know, the specter of war is mounting in Europe. And America is in a crisis place of leadership. And FDR comes to the White House. He's the man who made famous the concept of the first 100 days of office. We now evaluate every president in terms of their first 100 days. What was it about FDR's style that was different in terms of the first 100 days? More legislation was passed in that first 100 days than in, I think, anybody's whole term in the past. He said, we have problems. We don't have time to sit around and think through all the long-range repercussions. We've got to act now and solve the problem now. People out of work, we'll put them to work. Never mind what that does to the budget. We'll worry about that later. You know, and if that and Kennedy's style was the same thing, as Harvey Cox said, only he thought about it more. Harvey Cox said that Kennedy's philosophy was this. I don't know how accurate his evaluation of Kennedy is, and I'm not here to criticize John Kennedy. I'm here to illustrate a style of pragmatism that is pervasive in our culture. The nation is bogged down in problems, as it was at the beginning of the 60s. And the plan of FDR was consciously embraced by Kennedy, and that is the style of problem solving. We call this the American way of life, or we call it Yankee ingenuity. When I lived in Europe, when I moved out of the American culture, I experienced real cultural shock. You don't realize how strong certain attitudes are in given societies until you leave those societies. But it's in our bloodstream, and if you don't believe it, move. Go to South America when everything happens mañana. Drive you nuts, okay? Our goal is, you know, the difficult we do immediately, the impossible just takes a little longer. That's part of our national heritage that comes out of this result orientation. But the problem, we run into problems like this, that pragmatism lives, again, as I said, humanism does, on borrowed capital. That's not my evaluation. That's pragmatists' own evaluation. I'm thinking here of William James, who says that truth is the cash value of an idea. So that the values you select along the way, you don't know whether they're true or not. Okay? The principles upon which you don't know whether they're true. We can't know whether they're true or not. But we borrow it. And then we try to cash it in. And when it works, that's the cash value. But the problem is, in this whirlwind of problem solving, and John Kennedy realized it and embraced it anyway, he said, you have a problem, solve it. Now the solution tends to do what? Give you another problem. In fact, it may give you two problems. We have a problem with people reaching retirement age and they haven't saved up enough money to care for themselves in their old age. So what do? We create an enforced retirement savings plan. And then people begin to think that that enforced retirement savings plan will cover their needs, not considering inflation. So inflation comes and the people retire and they find out they don't have the social security they thought they had, so the government now begins to supplement it. Okay? And pretty soon it becomes the elephant that's about to sink the ship. But it doesn't happen in 6 weeks. It happens in 30 years, or 40 years, or 50 years. The long-range consequences begin to make themselves fall. But you do the short-range solution, it creates a problem or it creates two problems. That's okay, the pragmatist says, we'll handle them as they come. We'll solve those problems. But if you're thinking short-term, what happens? Now you got 4 problems. You solve those, now you got 8. You solve those, now you got 16. And by exponential growth, the problems of the culture escalate and explode and bring the house crashing down. This is the point where the Bible is saying, yes, truth is that which works, but that which works must be measured by the eternal norms of God. The real conflict between Christianity and pragmatism is the conflict between what is right and what is expedient. As Josiah Royce stated it, and with this I'll close because I'm running out of time, he said, if you want to see how pragmatism degenerates at the ethical level, think of the oath that a person is called upon to give on the witness stand in a law court and change it to pragmatist categories. Do you swear to tell the expedient, the whole expedient, and nothing but the expedient? So help you expediency. There you see the conflict between a man who lives for eternal God with eternal norms and eternal truth, and those who exchange that, their birthright, for short-term consequences of expediency.